everything that astronomy provides to serve as a tool to improve well-being. So we want to harness the awe-inspiring wonders of the universe, and we want to use this to allow people to reflect. So as people are staring out into the night sky, how can we encourage them to also stare inwards and engage in some self-development, self-reflection? Now, currently, we've been doing a lot of resource development. We've gotten positive feedback from online workshops, focus groups, and retreat that we did. And now with the networking collaboration, what we're trying to do this year is see how can we expand on this. So knowing that the resource is useful for individuals is great, but now we want to see how can we make a material available that is like a train the trainer type of material where individuals or organizations would be able to access that and then really run with it themselves. And then we can encourage them in any support that they might need with them running it. And in doing so, the idea would be that we would reach just so many more people. Now, when we talk about mental health, the reason we chose mental health as one of the areas of focus is close to 1 billion people suffer from mental health conditions, and that's stats from quite a few years back. It's considered that about 1 in 8 people are currently living with a mental health disorder, and recent studies showed that almost half of the people on the world, throughout the globe, would experience a mental health disorder within their lifetime. And when we say mental health disorder, this is anxiety and depression related disorders. Now, the big thing we want to see how can we use astronomy to step in is to help people develop more resilience, help them to equip them with skills just to be able to deal with the situations and then still access help that they need. And the reason we think that there is a need for that is because 80% of the people that do experience a mental health condition don't really have access, either because of physical access or just because of affordability of the treatments that are available. And then the last point there, about half of the mental illnesses begin at age 14. So that's also a broad spectrum of people that can be reached if we are able to develop something that's useful. Now, the role that astronomy will play is based a lot on research. So there were 3 main studies that we looked at. The research done at the University of California in Berkeley, Stanford University, and then there's a lot of smaller studies and personal accounts. Now, throughout of these studies, they all highlight the positive impact that nature and the night sky can have on your mental health and your well-being. Collectively, they show that being in a natural environment, being under the night sky, increases your life satisfaction, gives you a sense of purpose, reduces stress and anxiety. And such experiences foster a feeling of connectedness. So people don't feel so lonely, they have a sense of peace and tranquility. And there's really an importance of nature and the night sky. One of the interesting parts of some of the studies is that they found that it's even effective whether it's not a real nature, it can be virtual nature as well. Now, I'm not going to keep you guys very long because I'll leave time for some questions. So it's important to know that mental health, well-being, and self-care, it's essential for everyone to consider because it is the components that fulfill your life. It helps you to go through your day-to-day, cope with all your challenges. It helps you to build relationships that are enjoyable for you, things that you can interact with. It helps you to be able to function, to give back to your community and society. And the slides will be shared. Don't worry, I'm not reading them verbatim. I'm trying to share with you guys a bit about our project. And it is in taking care of ourselves, taking care of our mental health that we'll be able to solve some of the biggest problems within society. So that's really also a large part of why we want to focus on mental health. Now, in summary, your brain is an amazing thing. It can store all the information that it gets. Even if you forget things, somewhere in your brain, there will be neurons that still retain that information. Unfortunately, that is information, whether it's good or bad, reason why it's also important to engage in self-reflection and work through your emotions, work through your memories. Now, what we want to do is take how astronomy is something that can really inspire people and just give you the space to ask these questions, do all of these activities in a setting where you don't have to feel threatened. You can just openly do the activities, do the self-reflection work, and benefit from that. And then the most important thing is that your mental health and well-being isn't something that's static. It's something that can improve, and it's a journey. It's something that you'll be experiencing throughout your life, and it's something that you can work on, and you can have a generally positive mental health and well-being throughout your life. Thank you. Yeah, then if there's any questions.
Hi, I have a question if I can.
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
yeah, I hear you.
It's Ed from Australia. I was wondering, it's a very interesting flagship. I was wondering if you could give us some practical examples of projects that are addressing this flagship, like the previous team showed us past projects addressing the other flagship, just to have
Yeah.
an idea.
So what we've done is we've worked small scale. We've worked with the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. So that's just doing some online talks for their support group leaders. So that's mental health care providers. We've classified them. We've done a survey that we sent out trying to ask some of the physics and astronomy students that we have access to, what type of things are they struggling with? And they came back with motivation, time management, things like that. Then we made a video series just giving them some ideas of how to cope with that. And we had a focus group with those students to go through those resources and see, is it something that would be useful for them? Then we did some self-care activities that were themed around the solar system, the different planets. And those were to encourage more, how can you go about doing some self-reflection? And we hosted those together with the IAPS, International Astronomy Physics Society, I think. So we had a day where we had online sessions for people coming for various sessions, and we ran through those tools to try and see how could they go about engaging in these self-reflections. And what we got from the projects is there's definitely an interest in the area. There's the people like it. They say that it is something that is approachable, at least for the people we've worked with, which could be biased because they were invited for an astronomy and mental health project and they came. So, but they also indicated that they would appreciate a resource that is a lot more practical. So really going down into the basics of if you're setting up for this activity with a group, say, how many people would you expect to do it with? What resources would you need? How would you go about introducing it to them? And that is what led us to where we are now, where we're trying to make really almost an A to Z trainer guide of some of the activities so that it's something that they could pick up, go through. And for example, so one of the activities would be guided relaxation. So we've got a mindfulness practitioner, which is previously was an astronomer, and he's working on a recording for that. And then we would say, okay, so if you're setting up, you have a group that is maybe outside, then we could say for outside, you would set it up in this way, inside in this way. You would need comfortable space, all those type of things. And then how can you go about it? And then also how can you include maybe some journaling or reflection, or so all the links to activities that they could do, how to do the activity. I don't know if that was useful in answering your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Any other questions?
Thank you, Dom. So with this flagship, I think it's interesting. Even if you're not specifically targeting mental health in your activities, or you didn't plan to, I think it's possible to design it in such a way that you can have that impact. So it's something of an additional feature that you can add to your projects, whether an OAD project or your other outreach activities. So please talk to Dominic about it. Dom, will you also drop a link and your contact information, please?
Yeah, I will. I just happened to send it directly to Sam instead of everyone. So let me see how I can send it to everyone.
So next, I would like to call upon Dudu Zule to talk about the third flagship on data science and other astronomy skills for development. Dudu?
I'm sharing my screen. Good afternoon, everyone. This is me. Hello. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Tutuzile Kupeka, and I'll be presenting on Flagship 3, which is Astronomy Knowledge and Skills for Development. So the aim of Flagship 3 is to use astronomy and use the knowledge and skills that are used in astronomy, such as programming, your data handling, or machine learning, as well as the infrastructure that we use, such as the cloud computing platforms, to advance development objectives through either the teaching or application of such skills. So this and how we execute this is through the form of hackathons or competitions. This is how we've done it so far. But ongoing, which I'll share later, is our plans of now running workshops and training sessions so that we can train more people to conduct their own hackathons. Benefits, so the implementation of these sort of workshops or hackathons, it could lead to an increase in the number of students or individuals who are confident in applying the skills that they learned to their own studies or apply it to their research or their careers, as well as to motivate for further their skills that they've learned, right? This would lead to enhanced employability and a greater contribution to the economy. This also leads to a growing number of cross-disciplinary and cross-sector data-intensive projects, as well as further partnerships with development and data science organizations, and a wider use of the infrastructure. A number of our hackathons, we have people from different backgrounds where there's an exchange of knowledge, there's networking that takes place, and therefore there's a contribution of different forms of knowledge and cross-discipline. So this is run under the project, rather, or what we call Hack for Dev. You can check this website. It's called Hack for Dev, Hackathons for Development, where we are developing data science skills from science and use those skills to address developmental challenges. So Hack for Dev, the main point or main aim of these data science hackathons, there are three broad goals: the development of skills for astronomy, development of skills beyond astronomy, that is through application of data science and other sciences, and also using these skills to address developmental challenges, which are tangible outputs. Objectives, we are providing exposure to data science and machine learning techniques through hands-on experience working with real-world projects. We are encouraging peer learning, developing of skills such as leadership, teamwork, and presentation. This is all structured in how we run the hackathons, where, like I said, we bring together people from different backgrounds, and they are usually grouped. And then from there, they form a team and must work together on a common project. And throughout that learning process, at the end, there'll also be an opportunity for them to present on their project and how they worked through the particular problem that they helped. Through such platforms, you get to see other people who advance as leaders in this platform, because others would take charge, and become the group leader. And they also learn skills such as teamwork, which enhances the importance of working together with people, whether you're in astronomy or data science or any other career field. And then the main partners of Hack for Dev, As yes, OAD is one of the main partners there. There's also IDEA, and we work with ILIFU. ILIFU provides the cloud computing platform that works together with IDEA. There's Data Big Data. There's the BITDN project for the BRICS astronomy. And then there's AFAS, which is the African Astronomical Society. So we've run a number of projects with these partners previously, and they are mainly responsible for the main vision and plans or goals of Hack for Dev, or rather Flagship 3. So these are some of the partners we have also, or other partners who we've worked with in the past year in running different hackathon projects. And, it's either they help maybe in organizing the project, or they assisted in providing tutors or providing training or career guidance in some of the events that we've hosted previously. I'm looking forward to, when I do this presentation next year, to also mention some of you, hopefully. So these are some of the hacks that we've run, or some of the hacks that we have in our database. I'll just scroll through them. You can find more of this on the Hack for Dev website. You can get to see and go to the GitHub and see the entire hack. Then you can see the SKA data challenge that's mainly run also with Sarao, and then the image classification of galaxies. So you'll notice with these hacks, it's not just limited to astronomy, like the robust-T classification. It also contributes to other forms of sciences, not just astronomy. There's the flood detection using remote sensing. And then the events we've had in the past year, this is entirely limited to the past year. There are others that were held even way before 2023. So from 2023, it was the Andrian Regional Hackathon. This was an online event. It was held in Feb. There was another one in South Africa at a university in KZN that was held with astronomy students. Yeah, and it was not just astronomy students, it was really students, postgraduate students and undergraduate students at that university and the neighboring universities in the province. And then the AFAS Data Science Hackathon was held during after the AFAS conference, and we had participants from various parts of Africa taking place. Then there's the Dawn of Data Stars Hackathon. This one was mainly targeted to high school learners, mainly grade 9 to 10. I'm really not sure how you translate that to the other countries, but grade 9 to 10. And we helped them with career guidance activities. And then there was a training on introduction to Python for a couple of weeks before the hackathon took place. And then the last one we hosted last year was the BRICS Astronomy Working Group Hackathon. This took place after the BRICS Astronomy Conference, and we had students. This one was mainly targeted to postgraduate students from the BRICS countries, and we worked with multi-wavelength data. So these are some of the images of our past hackathons. Hack for Dev, or rather Flagship 3, is really run by a big team of individuals, as you've seen the partner organizations. So there are many individuals involved in the implementation and success of the project. The last one that we held, which you probably won't find yet on GitHub, is the Analyzing Multi-Wavelength Astronomical Data with Machine Learning. So this one was mainly targeted to postgraduate students, and I think it went relatively well. This is the high school hackathon that I just told you about. How this was run is we first had the career day where we invited speakers or role models who are working in the space of data science in different, different roles in data science, who got to engage with the learners about what they do. And then after the career day, we then had learners participate in the training, which introduced them to basic Python programming. And then after those few weeks of Python, we then had the hackathon, which took place over a span of 2 days. So this was a simple and quite fun one, I must say. The main objective of this one for the high school learners was we used the emotion classification hackathon, or hack. The main objective was to guide participants from capturing images, and then they classified them using machine learning. So the whole process was fun, and I think that's what made it so memorable even for the learners, because they spent time, you know, capturing various emotions using their phones and capturing emotions using themselves, you know. And then second part of the second task was they were using ChatGPT and Google a lot for the binary image classification. This one was, of course, guided because the learners are quite young and are not expert coders yet. So it was very guided where there's tutorial and then we have tutors also available at every hackathon that we host who are there to offer support for the learners. As you can see here, this is the room where we had the lessons weekly. So that's just one of the projects. The strategy for sustainability for this flagship is to develop resources and infrastructure to allow for sustainable hackathons. And then we're also looking for institutions or various other groups to run these hackathons independently without us really interfering. All we can do is as much as provide resources and training. Then there's the continued development of the hackathon project, where we are also now engaging with researchers to translate their research projects into a hack that can then be used and applicable in real time. And then continued growth of a pool of tutors, trainers, and organizers. Guidelines for organizers that are available is we offer the list of requirements, we offer hackathon tutorials and data, there's tutor training resources, there's admin and budgeting guidelines, and the cloud computing platform. If you were to get in touch with us, we can assist you with getting access to that cloud computing platform to be able to run the hackathons on your own. So these are the upcoming projects for this year, which I mentioned. We'll be training more hackathon organizers. So please look out for that call if you are interested to train. We'll be training more people who can be able to run these hackathons regionally, wherever they are based. And then we'll also be training, this will be mainly focused on teachers. We'll be training teachers to conduct hackathons and also just training them on basic tools such as how to use ChatGPT, you know, and yeah, so that would equip them also in their classrooms. And then the high school hackathons will definitely continue in more regions. So this is a summary of flagship 3. And then this is me now seizing the opportunity. The IAU General Assembly will be held in Cape Town, South Africa this year. And one of my other roles is co-chairing the Outreach and Education Committee. So I think you are a very relevant group of people to share this information with. We have a number of activities planned out from now up until the GA and even afterwards. But mainly during the 2 weeks of the GA, there are opportunities for people to visit astronomy facilities and organizations across Africa. So the call is out. We're looking for people mainly in Africa who want to host people. I want to host astronomers who would like to maybe give a talk at the institution or go around with you and run, maybe run role modeling activities or career guidance or some activities wherever you are based in your institutions, any of those options. And then there is an opportunity to visit local schools and communities in South Africa during the National Science Week and the General Assembly. So directly a week before the GA, we have the National Science Week in South Africa, where we celebrate science. Every institution, organization that works in the field of science and technology, they conduct activities throughout that entire week. So this year, we are making the theme astronomy, and we are calling out to people who will be visiting Cape Town for the GA to maybe come a week earlier and participate in National Science Week. You can even get the opportunity to explore other parts of South Africa that week, maybe be placed in a different province or city, and then you'll come back to Cape Town for the week of the GA. But it will mainly be outreach and science engagement activities. For us, our main goal is to spread the word and ensure that astronomy reaches everyone, even in the remote communities. And then the other project is participating in organizing events for the IAU GA Astrofest. So we acknowledge that other people will not be able to come to the GA in August. So we still want to make this a global event. So we would like people who want to host astronomy activities during the 2 weeks of the GA, wherever they'll be based in the world, to get in contact with us so we can maybe plan together and market your event on our website. And we want to also explore options of probably live streaming your events, and we connect with each other from time to time during the GA. And then I don't know if it's been mentioned to you before by Ram or anyone here, but the GA is fully open access. So all the sessions will be live streamed. So this is another opportunity to tap into this and reach out to everyone in the world through these activities that we'll be conducting as part of AstroFest. And then there's an opportunity for linking astronomy with the arts, where there'll be days that are dedicated to engagements of storytelling. There'll be arts competitions, there'll be some music, some dancing, all of that. And then the ambassador program, where we're engaging with ambassadors. And you can be one, so please get in touch. As long as you want to run outreach activities or science engagement activities in your respective countries or online, or write blog posts about astronomy that we can also share on our platforms and you share on yours. But the main point is to really ensure that astronomy reaches out to as many people as possible. I don't know about where you are from, but where I'm from, the only time you'd ever hear about astronomy is if you probably visit Cape Town, In certain remote communities, you don't really know much about this field or how to branch into it or what exactly happens, except that you look at the stars and there's something called astronomy. So we are trying to close that gap. We're trying to reach out to as many people as possible. The communications one is the last one. The communications ambassadors, this one is mainly targeted to people who are doing science communication or astronomy communication. This is either through writing or in podcasts, or they do video content, or they're in local radio stations. Here we are trying to again communicate astronomy. So there are opportunities for this too. I really can't get into much details, I'm sorry, but please do email me on either outreach@astronomy2024.org or duduzile@sao.ac.za, so we can share more information about Flagship 3 and about the GA and outreach activities that you can participate in. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Dudu. I see that you have a lot of slides there. Okay. Thank
But
you.
I
Any
moved
questions?
fast, eh? I mean, my 2 minutes was not up.
Any questions for Dudu? So again, with this flagship, there's the resources, the OAD and partners have developed the resources, and if your university or your research group, if you want to run hackathons, then please get in touch. Dudu, if someone can you copy the link? Yeah. Okay, see the hack for the link there. Yes, so that's the 3 flagships. And just on the GA, I just want to remind everyone that the OAD will have a whole day of sessions on astronomy for development at the GA. The call for abstracts is open until the 1st of March. There are also opportunities to apply for a grant. Again, the deadline is the 1st of March. So please do submit your abstract on astronomy for development activities and projects. If you have any questions, please email us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is
yeah.
Ari. I'm sorry, I am without electricity, so I am joining with my phone. And but I have a question. Like, if someone would like to participate to this flagship, someone that's not yet connected with IAU, can they simply email you, for example? Because there is a center for science and development here in Rio. It's called CBPF, that they do a lot of work with machine learning and artificial intelligence, and they would love to join OAD and IAU. So could they simply email and get in touch?
Yeah,
Okay.
pretty much. Dudu, can you copy your email address in the chat, please?
Okay, I'll type it just now.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll just spend a couple of minutes to talk about reporting and communications. I won't take long, and then Sophie can come in with the evaluation stuff. Okay. Yeah, I just want to, emphasize that the OAD is not simply a grant-making body. We don't see ourselves as just a grant giver, and I hope you also don't just see us that way. That we are here to participate in the success of your project. So we would like to get more involved than just giving you money. And usually this takes the form of, giving you other forms of support, network building, maybe helping you seek additional funding, giving you any necessary training, and a bunch of other non-financial support. So this whole onboarding session is also part of that. We'd like you to get to know the other projects better and spend some time thinking about stuff like evaluation and fundraising. So there's a session of fundraising tomorrow. So that's number one. Number two is we only know what you tell us. So the only thing that we are getting out of your project is the data that you give us, whatever information that you submit about what you have done. So we have some guidelines on what kind of information we would like you to collect, what kind of information we would like you to submit at various points during the project cycle. So I'll go through those, but that's what we expect out of your project. Let's see. So this is a rough timeline of the project cycle. So we already sent you the money. I think almost everyone except one project has received the funds. This is our onboarding session. So a couple of times during the year, I try and meet you one-on-one. Well, you and your teams virtually. So this is just to catch up on what's happening in the project, any issues that you're facing, and so on. Other than that, other than those meetings, we ask for two reports. One is the mid-year report. I typically send out an email in July. And then we ask for the final report, which I'll ask for early next year. So two reports and two meetings, sort of the basic reporting requirements from the OAD side. And then this is some of the information that needs to be covered in the reports. The mid-year report is a short report and the final report is a longer one. They're both in the form of Google Forms. So we ask for a bunch of things, what did you do? Who did you target? More details on the audience, how many people, how many girls, how many boys, how many women, and so on. And then deliverables. What did you produce during the project? Like presentations, lectures, courses, videos, and so on. Our most important sort of priority is the outcomes. I think I mentioned this to all of you when I emailed about the project plans. So in each of our project plans, we would like you to try and refine those outcomes as much as possible. The outcome is what we're most interested in, because we want to use astronomy to create some sort of specific change in society, and this is what will define the change, the outcome. So we are very interested in the outcomes, and we would like you to report on the outcomes. And there's a bunch of other stuff. So all of this information is available on the website. I will send you a link to that at the end of the day today. But this is what we need from our side. For multi-year projects, it's slightly different. So because of the way the IAU funding works, we can only release funding for 1 year at a time. So you will also submit a mid-year report, and then at the end of the year, instead of a final report, we will ask you to do a short assessment report, based on which we will release the funding for the next year. So that's something slightly different for multi-year projects. Let me stop there. Any questions about reporting? No question. Okay, so anything on the flagships before we move on to the second part of our session? If not, then Sophie, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ram. I'm just going to share my screen as well. Can you see that okay? Cool. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Sophie. Thank you for having me or joining me at today's session. So I'm an education researcher and evaluator. I'm based at the Office of Astronomy for Education and also at Cardiff University in the UK. So today I wanted to just talk a bit about how we can use different techniques and practices to evaluate your development, education and outreach projects, and what that might mean for any future projects as well. So I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so just covering key components of what we mean by evaluation and what is involved with it. And then after the 30 minutes, we'll hopefully have a bit of a group activity that we can do as well to look at some kind of previous case studies of projects. So I'll talk a bit about what is involved and what is expected from the evaluation of development projects, how to set meaningful objectives so that will reflect appropriately what you're trying to do and give you the best possible outcomes from your projects. Also, how to frame your project and identify what might be some influential factors to its success. So if there are any potential challenges that you need to kind of mitigate or anything like that. So thinking about any assumptions or expectations that you're basing your project on. Also, who to gather data from. So what kind of feedback data or evaluation data you want to get that from, who might be best placed to provide that information. It's not necessarily always the direct audience that you engage with. Also, when to gather this data. So either before you've implemented any project, during the project itself, or maybe after you've finished, you might do a follow-up several months later or something. And then we'll also look at a few methods and techniques for collecting this kind of data and various creative methods that you can kind of adapt and choose depending on what fits the format of your activities that you're doing. And then just to kind of build on from what Ram has just discussed, a bit about how you might want to report the results. And hopefully I'm going to use some various examples throughout, so that will hopefully guide, provide a bit of context to what I'm talking about as well. But a key place to start is to kind of define evaluation. It kind of comes under a big umbrella and can be interpreted very differently in different cultures and different countries and in different languages. So in this context, we are talking about evaluation in the sense of how well something works and the extent to which your intended outcomes are achieved. So to what extent did you do what you hoped you would do? And so it captures the value and the effectiveness and impact of something. So that something could be a public science festival or an astronomy camp or something like that. Evaluation also accounts for particulars. So it focuses quite strongly on the context and the environment of the activity. So things like cultural and socio-economic factors as well. So these are other aspects that could be influencing kind of how your project looks in practice. And evaluation is often compared to research. And so in doing a comparison there, evaluation is usually more project specific. So where research aims to provide quite generalizable findings, evaluation tends to provide what we call more transferable findings. So it's much more descriptive in what it's doing. In research, you'll often say, oh, this program works everywhere. But with evaluation, we're kind of provide a more realistic approach in that we say this program works under these circumstances when these processes take place. So it's much more contextual based. And to start with, evaluation should always start with an objective. A common pitfall I see time and time again is people start thinking about how they might evaluate their project, what kind of instruments or surveys they want to use, but they're doing this before they've really set out an objective or really have a clear idea of what it is they're trying to achieve. So really, before you do anything, you should map your plan to what objectives you're trying to achieve and what kind of evidence you'll need to demonstrate whether those objectives have been met. And it just means it makes it much easier to demonstrate the impact that you've had at the end. So something you might have come across before are SMART objectives. These are just kind of a nice checklist way of making sure that you've kind of set a good objective. So it's an acronym that basically stands for specific. So exactly what is it you're trying to achieve? So earlier we saw those fantastic kind of global challenges, but you wouldn't set an objective of promote gender equality across the world, because that's just too big for kind of the scale of projects that you're doing here. So instead, you might want to do something much more specific that will be, for example, improve kind of access to science clubs or astronomy clubs in the local area or something like that, or kind of level the gender balance there. So something much more kind of realistic into what your project might reach. Also measurable. So a really key thing is making sure that your objective has a way of being evident. So you can measure something or capture something that will demonstrate whether you've achieved your objective. That's often what funders will really be looking for. They'll want to know kind of how you're going to demonstrate whether you've done it or not and how you've been successful. And that's particularly important if you're hoping to maybe publish your findings in any academic journals or magazines or anything like that. It should also be, so similar to specific, it should also be achievable. So is this realistic to what it is you're doing and in the program kind of limit that you have? So are you likely to have this kind of level of impact of your objective? So often I'll see people set like a really highly ambitious objective that is just never going to be achieved. And all that does is makes it look like the project was poor or wasn't executed very well, when actually it had really good impact. It just didn't have it in the area that the objective said. So, for example, if you're working perhaps with 1 or 2 schools, it's unlikely that you're going to increase a national uptake of astronomy courses by just engaging with 2 schools. So it's about being kind of realistic and setting an achievable objective that you think you can meet. Also making sure it's relevant. So this is kind of where you need to think about your audience as well. So does your activity actually address the issues that exist, and do these issues exist for the people you're engaging with? So it should be something that is ultimately going to benefit your audience. Do they need this? Is it relevant to them? So often we see a lot of projects that are trying to promote career aspirations and kind of disseminate information around different careers available to people. You're less likely to do that perhaps with adults who have already picked their career, or very young people, so like 5 to 7 year olds, and they're not really thinking about their career. So making sure that the objective of what you're doing matches with the audience that you're working with. And then also just set a deadline, make sure you have a time frame. This is kind of an easy one, and often you'll have funding for a set amount of time and you'll have kind of an implementation plan. So it will probably align with that. But also you may want to do a longitudinal follow-up with your participants. So say you implement a project 1 year, you might want to follow up with those same audience members a year later to see if there's any long-lasting impact. So make sure you're kind of clear on what you'll need to do and how long that will take. So just to give an example, this one's about a teacher training program. And the kind of big vision is to increase teachers' confidence in astronomy teaching. But obviously, what we want to do is make that more specific. So here we would say we will increase teachers' confidence in teaching the Earth, Moon, Sun system. So it's not just kind of a blanket statement of teaching astronomy. We're being very specific about a particular area that we can measure whether that's had an impact or not. And then to measure it, it will involve implementing a survey that measures the teacher's confidence both before and after they've engaged with the teacher training program. So kind of a baseline and an end point, so you can measure the different change. So we'll be able to see any difference in whether the teacher training programs had an effect. It's achievable because the teacher training program itself is going to focus on the Earth, Moon, Sun system and methods of teaching these concepts. So if you were delivering a TTP workshop on kind of Jupiter and Jupiter's Galilean moons, obviously you'd set a slightly different objective. I realize that's kind of stating the obvious, but it's just useful to go through these processes. And it's relevant to teachers because if they feel more confident in teaching these areas, they will probably use better implementation techniques with students, and they may also share those techniques with their colleagues and their peers. So it's certainly something that they will see as a benefit to them as well. And then this is obviously an old slide, but so I'd set a time limit. So if your teacher training event is going to say it finishes November 2024, that is the objective. So you want to see teachers' confidence will have increased by the end of that. And then something else that you might have come across and is useful once you've set your clear objective is you can begin to construct a bit of an evaluation plan. And a really popular method and really helpful method for doing this is using a logic model or a theory of change, which you've probably come across. They're very transferable across sectors, so they're often used in business as well as education and development projects. So essentially, a logic model is a graphic illustration of a project's circumstances, its resources, its activities, intended outputs, and the intended effects or outcomes that you're expecting to have. So that, as you can see, they're displayed very simply, and you may have come across slightly different variations with different headings. This is the one that I tend to use. You may have also seen just outcomes and without the impact column here on the end. But this is essentially, the impact stuff is really important when you're trying to promote a theory of change. So I'll come back to that as we go through each of these. So context is essentially the circumstances and the environment or setting that surrounds your project. So if you're working with refugees or something, there's an important context to that that will differ to perhaps working in like a very Western classroom or something like that. And so your context will typically include a particular problem that you're trying to address. So what area of development are you trying to have an impact in? You'll also have assumptions. So these are kind of facts or conditions that you assume to be true. And that will, of course, influence the success of your project. So a key assumption is that perhaps your audience will want to engage with the project. And then we have resources or input. So these are elements or components that exist and are available to contribute to your project. So you've had funding from the OAD, that would be included as a resource. You may have particular staff members or a team. You may have a particular space that you can use. So these are all resources that are being input into your project. Then you can list the activities. So that's essentially the project itself. So what you're implementing, whether you have an intervention or something like that. So what you'll be doing, what kind of actions will be carried out, and how your project will essentially take shape. Then you can list outputs. So these are different to outcomes in that outputs are kind of things generated as a direct result of your activity. So you should be able to directly observe them. So this might be a resource, like an educational resource. You might develop a new website. So kind of hard things that come out of your project. And they may also be your actual deliverables. So if you're doing any reporting and you have to meet certain milestones and produce deliverables, these would be included in your outputs. And as you develop the logic model, because you're doing this at the beginning, the outcomes and impact section kind of are hard to set out at the beginning, and these are more predicted and expected. So you won't know, obviously, the known or actual outcome or impact of your project. But what it's helpful to do at the start is have a think about what you hope they will be. So the outcomes are essentially the result or change that occurs as a result of your activity. So they will often, although not exclusively, relate to your audience or the participants that you're directly engaging with. And again, you should be able to measure these or observe kind of whether this outcome has taken place. And so, as I mentioned before, logic models will often just stop at outcomes, and they won't necessarily have this additional impact column. But impact is a really important factor in a theory of change, and they are kind of the larger scale impacts and inferences that you can make as a result of your outcomes. So your outcomes kind of lead on to the impacts. So this is where it could relate to kind of the sustainable development goals that the OAD set out. So those kind of bigger net zero, gender equality, things like that. These are where they would come under the impacts, if that makes sense. So I'll look at an example because I appreciate it's a bit abstract to go through that. So I've used an example of running a space camp for children aged 9 to 14 in a specific country. And the context surrounding this project is that young people are not choosing to pursue science or STEM subjects. Many lack access to dark skies, so they're not really aware of kind of how they can engage with astronomy. It's not really directly available to them. Astronomy is also not featured heavy in their curriculum. So when they're at school, they don't really learn much about astronomy and the night sky. And because of that, young people and the wider public kind of lack an understanding of the applications of astronomy, and as we saw earlier, about the transferable skills that they offer and how they can use that elsewhere. And then I'll have some basic assumptions. So I'm hoping that parents might be looking for kind of summer activities or something for their children to do and to engage with peers like them. So kind of that social aspect they want them to have when they're no longer in school. And hopefully children will be interested in topics of space and astronomy. So a camp about this is something that will appeal to young people. And of course, certainly not an assumption I'd make here in the UK, is that you will have favourable weather conditions to permit observing nights during the camp. So that's an assumption you might make. And then in terms of resources, you've had funding from the OAD for your project, so that's an input. You have perhaps a delivery team with existing experience of working in astronomy, but also with kind of this group of young people aged 9 to 14. You might also have access to some telescopes or various equipment that can be used during the camp for activities. And what would be really great is if you also have perhaps a pool of volunteers or amateur astronomers that might be able to assist in some of the delivery. And then the activity, of course, will be the delivery of the space camp itself. And for the context of this example, I'm going to assume this is kind of a multidisciplinary hands-on event. They'll be doing various creative activities. So there might be some music, there might be some art, there'll be some science, some maths, and of course there'll hopefully be some observing nights. And then in terms of outputs, well, you might develop a series of activities or resources, like hands-on things that they can engage with and that can perhaps be reused or repackaged for other events or for use in schools or community events. You might also develop like a how-to or an itinerary for a camp and develop a bit of a curriculum for the week that could be used to repeat implementation elsewhere or in another setting. And then in terms of outcomes, you might expect that the children will enjoy the camp and are enthused by astronomy. Hopefully it will increase their exposure to dark skies so that they're not usually getting day to day. So if you have to kind of, if you're hosting the camp somewhere a bit more rural and are inviting young people from more urban areas. And they will leave the camp with hopefully an increased understanding of astronomy and its applications elsewhere, and also an increased interest in it. So they might kind of follow up their future activities with it. And then in terms of impact, sometimes I find it quite helpful to distinguish between kind of short-term, medium and long-term outputs. So this might depend on if you're doing repeat implementation or upscaling projects. Obviously, the more, if you implement a camp over and over again, perhaps the first time you only have 10 pupils, but over time, as you do it year on year, you might have engaged with over 100 pupils or something. So obviously the impact's going to kind of upscale as time continues. So that's just kind of a quick overview of a logic model. And just to kind of set out the differences between whether you might pick a logic model or a theory of change, which one you might want to use, because they are very similar. But essentially a theory of change goes a step further than a logic model. So where a logic model will kind of just set out the inputs and the outcomes, it will say if we provide X, the result will be Y. A theory of change also includes a bit more about the causal mechanisms and processes that takes place. So why X leads to Y. So what is happening there, kind of what experiences is taking place. So where logic models are kind of much more descriptive, they're kind of a surface view, a theory of change is much more explanatory, so understands kind of the underpinning processes. So a theory of change is particularly useful when you might want to track long-term impact. So for many projects within the OAD, I've seen that there are kind of long-term goals, that attitudes and aspirations in science will shift, and economic prospects will be promoted for young people. Of course, again, the kind of global challenges, you're not going to reach those global challenges or fix them overnight. So that's kind of a long-term goal, and you can set out a theory of change to reach that. So that's when you might want to use one over the other. Then another important thing to consider, although it seems quite obvious, is who to collect data from. And there's often kind of generally 4 key participant groups that you might want to choose from, whether you do one or all of them or a combination. And the most obvious one is, of course, your immediate audience. So in the context of the space camp, it would be the 9 to 14-year-olds on the camp. But it also might be helpful to gather feedback data from their family members, so their parents or carers, or community leaders as well, people who are particularly close with them. So this is particularly relevant when you are engaging with young people, because you might see that kind of responsible adults in their life pick up on more things and may notice a change in their behavior, or might say, oh yeah, since the camp they've not stopped talking about astronomy or something. So that can provide some really valuable information that you wouldn't necessarily get from speaking to the audience directly. Also stakeholders, so that's essentially just anyone that has any kind of level of involvement or stake in your development project. So perhaps you're kind of hiring a venue, or you're working in collaboration with a museum or a planetarium or something. So people that work there may be able to offer some insight and some feedback as well. That's useful data to capture. And also you yourselves, it's important not to forget that you can also provide valuable information about the delivery and success of the project. You're kind of experts in your own rights and have a wealth of experience of doing various projects. So it's really helpful to kind of be reflective throughout the process, and even kind of just logging what happens and your takeaways. But essentially, when you are thinking about who to collect data from, some key things to think about, again, is what are your objectives. So who can provide this information? Is this something, can I measure my objective by speaking to these people? Also, the accessibility of your audience. So what you might find is just you're doing such an intense program with young people, you really don't want to detract from that and take them away from what they're doing to ask them for feedback. So actually, maybe it'll be better to speak to the parents when they come and collect them or something like that. So think about how easy it is to get this data, make it as easy for yourself as you can. And also the nature of your activity and how audiences are participating. So, for example, if you're doing an online event, you're not going to hand out paper copies of things. You might have kind of an online voting system. So try and pick, I always say that the best methods of evaluation are ones that kind of seamlessly embed into what you're already doing. They don't feel like an additional add-on or chore, and they just fit seamlessly with that. So how can it be best embedded in your program? Then, of course, there's the choice of when to collect data. So there are different time points. There are generally 5 time points to consider in the context of your project. So pre, during, post, pre and post follow-up. So pre refers to kind of pre-event or pre-intervention. So this is the data that you'll collect before your audience has engaged with any of your activities. So it gives you kind of an unbiased baseline and gives you a sense of how they are feeling or their understanding as they come into your project. So you might want to ask the audience about their existing perceptions, their understanding. You may even want to just ask them why they decided to attend your event or your project and what they hope to gain from it. So it provides you with that benchmark to see what impact you've had. Then we have kind of during your data collection, during your project. So this is the data that you might collect while your event is taking place. So this is really useful if you want to capture data on kind of what your audience is doing, how they're engaging with your event. So a really popular one is having graffiti walls. If you're at an in-person event, people can kind of just stick messages about their experience. You might have some questions to prompt them, things like that. Then we just have post. So this is after the activity, so the data that you'll collect after your audience has finished engaging with your activity. So it therefore gives you a bit of an understanding of how they feel following their experience, and you may ask them to kind of reflect on their experience of the day, how it compares to their expectations. So you don't necessarily need to collect pre-data as well. You can ask people to reflect, but again, it will just depend on kind of what objectives you're trying to answer and what the format of your event is. And then pre and post is often what you see time and time again in kind of publications of research. So it will often involve kind of repeated data collection, asking the same questions before and after, so that you can kind of directly measure any change that's taken place. So measuring those direct comparisons to kind of draw an inference about what impact you've had on those audiences. And then follow-up is really important, but much less frequently seen. It's much more difficult to do. But it is very easy to have kind of a short-term impact on your audience. Often they will leave an event very excited and enthused or with fresh new knowledge. But actually, what you might want to do is find out whether that impact is long-lasting, or perhaps you want to ask if they remember anything from your event a few months later or even a year later. So collecting feedback data after some time has passed since your activity is often referred to as follow-up data. And then you might want to do a comparison kind of between pre, post and follow-up to kind of see how that perspectives change across that time. And so now I want to just talk a little bit about how we can collect evaluation data and what kind of tools you might want to use. So I'm going to actually skip through some of these because I want to kind of eventually stop talking and give you some stuff to look at as well. So I want to kind of direct you to a recent release of the OAE, which is an evaluation framework and toolkit. So we've essentially published this document that provides a series of tools that you can implement to capture feedback from your audiences. And within the toolkit, there are 8 different tools, and for each one, it provides a description of the tool itself, what kind of data it's good for collecting, what you will need to implement it. So if you need any equipment or space or anything, or if you need an internet connection, how to use it with your audience, and what is the process for kind of collecting data with it. Some examples of what kind of questions you might want to ask depending on what your objectives are. So it kind of sets out a variety of different kind of common objectives. So whether it might be increase interest or increase knowledge or understanding. So it will kind of recommend different types of data collection based on what you're trying to do with your audience. And it also provides kind of a summary of the advantages and disadvantages of each tool. Often some will be much more time consuming or will take much longer to kind of interpret the data. So thinking about what might be most useful for your project. And then, of course, what to do with the data once you have it. So what kind of analysis processes you can follow. So I will just quickly run through the different tools that we have in the toolkits. So we do set out 8 different tools. Of course, these are not exhaustive. There are a myriad of different ways you can collect data, and I'm sure you will have your own ideas of how to do that and may have done in the past. But the reason we've chosen these 8 is because they essentially provide a variety of different approaches to collecting data. So hopefully at least one of them will accommodate your project, your activity, your audiences. So there should be kind of something in there for everyone, hopefully. So the first method is graffiti walls. So this generally involves using large sheets or poster paper or post-it notes on walls where the audience can write or draw on that kind of shares their experiences of the event. So these work best when the audience have a bit of a prompt of what to respond to. So you might have kind of a wall at one of your events that says, you might ask a question like, what did you enjoy most today? And then people can kind of add their thoughts and things like that. And you can dot them around the event. And it's quite a nice way for the audience to decide for themselves how much they want to contribute. So whereas if you just hand out a survey, they might feel a bit under pressure and they might not want to answer all the questions. So this gives them a bit more kind of onus and control over how much they're participating, if they want to or not. Then we have Mentimeter. There are various different names for this. So another version is called Kahoot, or you may come across other examples. But essentially, Mentimeter is a free online presentation tool that captures audience feedback in real time. So you might pose a question to your audience, and they can vote using any electronic device, really, so their phone, laptop, computer, and they can respond to questions that you ask and see their response come up. They'll see their peers, the other audiences come up. So it's quite a quick, fast way of capturing data, and also very useful if you're doing an online event, like a webinar or something. A survey, obviously, this is probably one of the most common ways people will collect data. Surveys are very good at kind of capturing structured and specific information from your audience. So if you have set areas that you want to ask about, you really want to make sure you tap into people's experiences about a certain aspect, you would use a survey, because it's kind of much where graffiti was much more loose, you have much less control about what people are going to say. You can be much more structured in providing surveys, but you can also kind of provide flexibility to that in the types of questions you ask. So you might ask kind of yes/no questions, you might ask them to kind of describe their experience, or you might ask them to pick from kind of a number of different answers. And one of my favorite ones, I think, is to get people drawing things. So it's just a very fun activity. It's much more accessible. So particularly when you're working with young audiences, some people might feel quite limited by their reading or writing abilities. So drawing just feels like much more accessible and much more expressive. So you might want to ask them to draw various different things. So we've often asked people to draw themselves in a science lesson. So that gives us an idea of kind of their identity with science, how they feel. Or you might want to get them to draw something to do with astronomy, if you want to look at what kind of knowledge they've gained, draw their favourite part of the event, things like that. So you can actually reveal a lot of information from a drawing. And it's much nicer going through lots of drawings than loads of survey responses. Then we have interviews. So these can be conducted either one-to-one or in groups, and these are really good for kind of capturing detailed and contextualized information. And they're much more flexible than surveys. So I can't tell you how many times I've seen surveys been implemented. I've done it myself, and people respond perhaps not how you're expecting them to, but you've only asked them the questions in the survey, so you can't really follow up on anything. But at least in interviews, if someone gives you a peculiar answer or something that you weren't expecting, you can then ask them another question or ask them to explain a bit more about that. So they give you a bit more flexibility in what data you capture, and also gives more autonomy to the participants. So it's kind of more free flowing rather than answering specific questions on a sheet of paper with rigid response options. A really nice one as well, particularly when you're working with young people again, is peer interviews. So this is when, instead of you asking questions, your audience members ask questions to each other. So particularly with young people, you might find that they're a bit more relaxed and candid when it's their peer they're speaking to, rather than scary astronomers and adults. And it's also really interesting. So sometimes I'll give them questions to ask one another, but other times I'll say to them to ask each other questions, because that can actually reveal quite a lot of meaningful information about what they think is important to ask and what they want to know about. So there's kind of extra layer of data collection there when giving that autonomy to them. And then, of course, you'll be familiar with tests and concept inventories, and Siamisu at the OAE has done a lot of work on kind of what makes a meaningful concept inventory and some meaningful language in that. So these are kind of the equivalent of a survey, but capture more information on knowledge and understanding rather than kind of attitude and experience. So this is what you might want to use if one of your objectives is to promote understanding or kind of increase knowledge gains in your audience. And then the final one that we recommend is encouraging participants to do a diary or journal entry. So this is to kind of get them to describe and also reflect on their experiences of the event that they've been doing. So this is particularly suited to any programs that involve multiple engagements with the same people. So you can kind of say you're doing a space camp, for example. So you might want them to keep a diary at the end of each day. They kind of write in their diary about what they've done, how they're feeling. It's good to provide some prompts about what you want them to write in there, rather than just giving them an open book. That can be quite intimidating and difficult for them to think about what to contribute. And then you can kind of track if there are any changes over time. Do they kind of come, if they're really not looking forward to it, or they're very shy at the start, how are they presenting at the end of it? So you can really unpick kind of the journey that they've gone on by looking at their diary logs there. And then just finally, to just touch on kind of reporting. So obviously Ram gave an overview of that, and I understand there is a specific kind of template that you will use with the OAD, and it will tell you what kind of information to include. But having looked at that, I would encourage you to include a logic model or your theory of change in your reporting, because it just kind of supports the detail that you're providing and the information about your activities, about your audience, your outputs. It's kind of a nice way of summarizing what you've done, and kind of sets out the structure for you. Also, make sure you talk about who you've engaged with. I've seen so many reports where it just says the audience enjoyed this, and I have no idea who the audience is. So making sure you kind of go through this bullet point is really helpful, and it's also helpful not just for kind of reporting for the sake of it for funders purposes, but if you want to kind of publish anything, so maybe in the Communicating Astronomy to the Public journal, or if you want to kind of publish in the academic journals, this is the kind of information that these wider audiences outside of the OAD will want to see. But also a really key thing to do is talk about your own reflections and inferences. So not necessarily the data you've collected, but your interpretation. So were your objectives met, and if they were, what was it about the process that you really think was the key success in that? Or if you weren't perhaps as successful as you might have been, why do you think that was? So you might have had terrible weather for observing nights, or anything like that that kind of really hindered your project or accelerated it in that way. And what would you then do next? So not only for your own projects, but what kind of advice would you offer others if they wanted to kind of implement something similar? So kind of making sure people don't have to keep reinventing the wheel, but kind of you can learn from each other and share those best practices. So I'm conscious I've done a lot of talking, so I'm going to stop now, and I think we do have a bit of time. It would be nice to do some breakout rooms, and this is an activity that I've done before, but we had a bit more time, so I've kind of drawn a dotted line to cut off. I think we'll just focus on these first two bullet points, but if you do have time to go on to the other aspects, then please do. But in a second, I'm going to share some case study programs of previously funded outreach and development projects, either from the OAD or the OAO in the past. So I'm just going to give you kind of a summary of a number of different projects. And in your breakout rooms, I will want you to pick one of those projects and think about what smart objectives you might decide on for that program. So what it is that you're going to try and achieve if you were implementing that program, and start thinking about building a logic model. So really just kind of straightforward bullet pointing. What kind of assumptions are you making? What's the surrounding context? What resources do you have available? And what you'll be doing, and what hopefully you want to see in terms of outputs, outcomes, and impact. So I will give you some examples, but I appreciate you do also have your own projects that have just been funded. So if you'd rather use that one instead, obviously by all means do that. It'll probably be much more relevant. But in case you want to do one of the examples, I will share my screen. Is that the best way to do it, Ram? Shall I just share the case studies?
Maybe we can ask people if they prefer to do this activity with their own projects. Does anyone not want to use your project? Is everyone comfortable using your own project? But I mean, if you're splitting into groups, I guess it might be difficult to use one project.
I mean, I can show the kind of examples, and if they
Yeah,
look at them
yeah.
and think, "Oh no, I'll do something else," so that's fine. But so perhaps if we do that for 10 minutes, then come back here, have a bit of a discussion, and then a Q&A or anything. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. Would you mind copying those bullet points into the chat, Sophie?
Yes.
The one from your last slide.
I will do that. Hope that's all clear as well.
Any questions before we break out, split up into breakout rooms? Is everyone clear on what needs to happen? So I think we'll assign maybe 4 or 5 people to each room. You basically pick one of the projects, one of the scenarios that Sophie will show now, and we just answer these questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'll because I think as soon as they go in breakout rooms, they won't be able to see my screen. So I'll just send a link to a Google
Okay.
Doc.
Yeah, perfect.
And so that should have a list of the case studies. Yeah, I hope that's okay. So if we come back at maybe 1:45.
10 minutes? Yeah, 12 minutes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then let's see, breakout rooms. So I'm doing 4 breakout rooms, 4 to 5 participants in each room. It's all random. So, Sophie, so I guess you'll move between the rooms.
Yeah, I can kind of drop in to different ones if I'm able to do that. Yeah.
Okay, let me make it 3 breakout rooms. Okay, you should see an option to join the breakout rooms on your screen. Sophie?
Cool. Are we all back? I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, so I feel like we could just, with the last 10 minutes or so, just open the floor to any kind of feedback of that, any kind of just going through that process, if there are any challenges, difficulties, or any general questions. Oh, yes, we have one already. Yes, Roshan?
Thank you. So, Sophie, we had a very interesting session because we got interrupted twice when the breakout room ended. But yeah, so the things that we were talking about, and one of the things that came up that I think Eduardo and I don't really have a clear reasoning on. By the way, we selected the mobile planetarium in remote areas as our project we want to discuss. So one of the things that I personally find a bit confusing and challenging in astronomy outreach, and especially measuring impact, is one, how do you really assess something as intangible as a wow, something as you know, as subjective as people finding something inspiring and amazing, and two, and I gave this example in my question, that if I'm doing a telescope outreach session and I have 10 people in line, and the 10th person says, oh, wow. So what are the chances that the 11th person might also say, oh, wow, but the level of awe might not be the same for those two people? So how do you then measure the impact of your intervention?
Yeah, those really great questions. And I'm afraid there isn't a magic bullet. I wish it was straightforward. And that kind of subjectivity is really challenging. And also something we have to think about quite a lot. Often we'll ask questions about like frequency of doing things, like how often do you look up at the night sky? And if you give the options of saying, oh, quite a lot or often, one person's quite a lot is every day, and then another person's quite a lot is once a week. So it's really ambiguous. And I think that's kind of the same sort of thing you were saying in terms of that wow factor. How wow is it? And I think, and to answer the first question as well, in kind of getting that tangible data, the best way to do it is to kind of triangulate different data sources by asking a variety of questions. So one thing that we often do is, so for example, with the drawing activity, we will ask someone to kind of draw themselves during doing the activity that they were doing. So maybe on an observing night. And then we'll also draw some like little clouds around on their piece of paper for them to write also how they were feeling. So you can kind of match the two together, because often what they draw and what they write is very different. So it kind of gives you a bit more meaning about what's going on there. Also just speaking to them. So if, like you said, if you've got 10 individuals, that's quite a manageable group, so you can kind of interact with them. So I would really encourage you to just speak to them, kind of follow up, say to them, oh, like, what did you find? What were you saying wow to? What did you like about that? And kind of trying to tease out a bit more information. Also testing your kind of instruments that you use. So I can't emphasize how useful it is to like pilot any questionnaire or questions that you're going to ask in interviews or anything like that, or even a simple statement as straightforward as draw yourself in today's activity, just seeing what kind of your target audience would do, and then just ask them about it, because so you just end up understanding that like young people's interpretation, or just anybody different to you, is going to have a very different interpretation of things than you might do. So I remember in the past we wanted to empower people and feel that people like them worked in astronomy and space science. But what we said to like 11-year-olds is, do you think people like you work in astronomy? And they said, no, 11-year-olds don't work in astronomy. And it's like, well, obviously that's how they're going to interpret that. When what we meant was people from your kind of culture, people that live around you, like people from your family, but obviously they take it very literally. And so that can be a huge challenge as well. So I think the key thing to do is try a lot of different ways. I know it's resource heavy, but just be upfront about it. Like, say we tried these different things. Really, we got the most meaningful information, and what we felt was the most reliable information from asking this question. This is why we thought it was that reliable. But also, like, don't over claim. I see this a lot, and I'm guilty for it as well. And especially when you're evaluating your own projects, like obviously you want to see success, and if they're enthusiastic, you're enthusiastic, and often you can get carried away, like, yeah, we've changed the world by this one-off activity. But that's why it's really important to do those reflective accounts and kind of make sure you kind of describe. So when you're doing your reporting, say, well, we saw this happen, they said they were really enthusiastic, this is what we observed, this is how they kind of compared across the field. But also, like you said, if they say wow when they look down a telescope, what other activities did they do that they didn't say wow to? So that's a really important thing, seeing where they react to different things, because often, say you've got like a whole day event of a number of different activities, if you just ask them how they felt at the end of the day, they may feel really great, but actually it could have been just down to being able to look through a telescope and see Jupiter and its moons. And actually all that time you spent showing them all the different constellations wasn't really that worthwhile. So make sure you kind of ask them very specific questions, if that makes sense. So you know exactly where you've had that input, why they've had that reaction, rather than because for all you know, you could have just done a 1 hour session and you'd have had the same level of impact than if you'd done that whole day thing. So it's useful for knowing that for future resource purposes as well. I hope that answers, but it's really difficult, and yeah, just being kind of transparent about what you asked, what kind of responses you get, and why you're making the inferences you are.
No, thank you very much. I think the initial analogy of triangulation, I think that was very well put. And
yeah,
also, trying to dig deeper into what the follow-up, maybe 3 other questions could be in addition to just saying, oh, wow. I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard to get kids to express themselves in more words than wow. It's like, okay, that's great, but why? What do you like? But doing that as much as you can and building that rapport. That's why if you're able to work with kind of the same students or young people over and over again, or the same communities, and build that relationship so they do kind of open up a bit more, and really just listening. So if you're there, although it's really helpful to have a survey or a physical data collection thing, can't underestimate the value of just being there and picking up on things. So often I will just look for things like, are they working in silo? Are they like, because a lot of the time, especially if it's a family event, kids will like drag their parents or their family members and say, come and look at this. So it's interesting to see like, well, what are they wanting to show? What are they wanting to share? So just little interactions like that can reveal quite a lot of what kind of impact and engagement they're having. Okay. Anybody else have any questions, queries, comments?
I do, if that's okay. So I have 2 questions. My first question is around the SMART framework. I was wondering, especially for a person like me doing this for the first time, how do you factor in some flexibility? Because when you start planning at the beginning and then you start doing your project, inevitably I think it's going to change somehow, right? So along the way, so how do you factor in the flexibility of saying, all right, I planned for this, I wanted to do this, but now we're doing something different, and I want to readjust my criteria so that it makes sense, and not still being true to my project, but acknowledging that it's changing? That's the first question. And the second is around evaluation. So how do you define success? Going back to what we just discussed, sometimes you have to to measure or try to measure something that is intangible, or really hard to assess anyway. So how do you define? My project, maybe it was different to what I proposed, but I still think it's successful. Is it an argue case that you make, or trying to demonstrate why you think it was successful, and when is the boundary to say, oh man, you're trying to justify something, but no, was not successful? Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. 2 really great questions. Sorry, there was just a drill, and if you heard that, it made me jump, but hopefully you didn't hear it. No, those are really great questions. So the first one, ultimately you can design a project and plan with as much detail as you want, but real life doesn't work like that, and there are often going to be changes. But I think in a way that makes it even more important that you do set out at the start what you're trying to do, and kind of have that track of that kind of log of what happens along the way. And it just means as well in the future, you'll be like, oh, well, we tried to do that before, but remember this happened and it just wasn't realistic and we had to do that. So I think it's really important to kind of track that and see, so kind of making sure you keep a log of why you change different things along the way. Also, something I've done in the past, when we've done like an education initiative, we developed like 2 logic models. So one was a logic model of intention, and one was like an actual logic model of implementation. So it was kind of, this is what we thought we would do, and this was what assumptions we made, this is what we expected the outcomes to be. But then the second one was like, actually, this is what happened in practice, and then this is why, because actually we were wrong in our assumptions about X, Y, and Z, and actually this is the real context that it was in. A lot of recent things have had the COVID pandemic, which has just thrown everything into array. So it's taking a really kind of realistic approach and just saying, actually, this is what happened, and it also adds to your argument, I think, about saying like the importance of evaluation is that you're not generalizing. You're not trying to say, if you do this, doesn't matter where you are and who you're working with, it will work, because that isn't what's going to happen. But the more information you gather in detail and say, right, this really works when this circumstance happens, like when you have parents and kids there and you have a glorious day, and you're able to do some observing. But if just one of these factors is missing, we observe completely different findings. So it's really helpful to have all that information there so that you know exactly what worked, what didn't, and how things work in practice. What was the second question?
Evaluation.
Yes.
How do you define that your project was a success,
Oh, yeah.
especially when you're measuring intangible things? And when do you draw a line to say, all right, I tried to justify why I think it was a success, but maybe it wasn't?
Yeah, definitely. And something I've seen time and time again is like you end up having kind of an impact in areas that you weren't expecting, or like you were like trying to target one thing and then you see something else, a different outcome. But it still has value. So I think a key thing there is, although it's important to set out what you're trying to achieve and be very specific about what you're trying to achieve, make sure when you're collecting your feedback data, again, it's similar to that last conversation about giving a bit of autonomy to the participants. So if you're only asking some very strict questions and they can only answer in a certain way, then you're only going to get that information. And yeah, the worst case scenario of that is that it seems like you've had so say you wanted to increase knowledge in the sun, earth, moon systems, and you don't do that. But what you might have done is just made them find it really interesting, and they've gone away and like tried even harder to understand it because they just found you really engaging or whatever. But because you've only asked about their knowledge, you won't know that you've had that impact kind of on their interest. So what I will say is, although you obviously want your data collection to be tailored to what you're trying to find out and to your objectives, if you can, just make sure that you, even just adding a question like, do you have any other comments about your experience? Or is there anything else you want to share? And so making sure you can, even if what you were trying to achieve didn't work, you can say, well, actually, this doesn't work for promoting knowledge, but it really works for promoting interest. So we need to go back to the drawing board about this, but this is something that we can take away in that area. So yeah, adding that flexibility into what you're asking and kind of handing some of that freedom over, I think is really important. Is that helpful? I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah,
it's trial and error.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think so. I like the idea of the giving autonomy to the participants, so that you can capture aspects that you didn't think about it, or they weren't obvious, but they're coming through anyway. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm conscious of time, but I hope this was useful, and I've put my email in the chat, so if anybody wants to arrange any other meetings or just has any questions, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you everyone for staying behind. So we have one last session tomorrow, but I'll send more information via email, and I'll share all the slides and recordings via email as well. Let me stop there.